On December 17, 1944, a small liaison plane came in low over a Field Artillery Battalion dug into the frozen hills east of St. Vith in the Belgian Ardennes. The pilot was a lieutenant named David Rundon, and the radio net that morning was a wreck of panic and jamming, so he did the oldest thing a flyer can do. He weighted a scrap of paper, leaned out over the gun pits, and let it fall. The note read, "German tanks are in Setz, heading our way." Setz was up the road, minutes away. The men who read that note served the 561st Field Artillery Battalion, and they were holding the wrong weapon for the fight that was coming. Their guns were long toms, 155mm M1s, the long-range guns of the Corps' artillery. A long tom threw a 95-pound shell 14 miles, over ridge lines its crews would never lay eyes on. It was built to kill from beyond the horizon. A deep rear gun whose 14-man crews aimed at coordinates on a map, not at the thing in the trees in front of them. And now the thing was in the trees in front of them. On a hill above the valley, the men of Charlie Battery did what no one designs a long tom to do. They cranked those enormous barrels down until they were nearly level, sighted on the German tanks crawling through the valley below, and fired over open ground at a target they could see with their own eyes. A gun made to reach the next county, shooting like a rifle at the next field. They could not hold their long, and they could not run. The thaw and the shell fire had turned the ground to a soup that swallowed boots to the ankle, and a long tom on the move weighed some 15 tons. The guns were sinking where they stood. And up the chain of command, an order was already taking shape that no gun crew is ever trained to hear. It was not about the enemy. It was about their own guns. Everything that happened in those hills turned on a single contradiction, and it lived inside the gun itself. The long tom was not a frontline weapon, and it was never meant to become one. It was a heavy, long-range field gun, the backbone of the American Corps artillery, and everything about it was built around one idea: distance. That idea was old and deliberate. After the First World War, an American board sat down to decide what the Army's heavy artillery should be for the next one, and the word they kept circling was reach. They wanted a gun that could throw a shell about 25,000 yards. They wanted it to climb to high angles and drop fire behind hills. They started from a French 155 of the last war, the GPF, then built something substantially their own around it through the lean budget years of the 1930s, and in 1938 settled on the 155mm gun M1. Every choice on the drawing board pointed the same way: farther. Nobody sketching that carriage ever pictured a crew lowering the barrel to look a tank in the eye. The choice paid off the moment the gun reached combat. The long tom first fired in anger in North Africa just before Christmas of 1942, and from there it spread to more than 30 Corps artillery battalions across Europe and the Mediterranean. Commanders learned they could lean on it. It was accurate, it reached far, and it punished whatever it touched, precisely where a heavy gun was meant to do its punishing, which was somewhere over the next ridge, out of sight. Because that was the whole point. A long tom did not fight the enemy it could see. It fought the enemy it could not. A battery set up miles behind the rifle companies, in positions surveyed and plotted in advance, and waited for a voice on the radio. That voice belonged to a forward observer, a man crouched in a church tower or a hedgerow or a ditch up where the fighting was, often a mile or more ahead of the guns. He was the eyes. He saw the target. The gun crews never did. What he saw, he did not send to the guns. He sent it to a fire direction center, a dugout full of maps and plotting boards and men doing fast, careful arithmetic. The Americans had built this system at Fort Sill in the 1930s, and it was, quietly, one of the war's great advantages. The Fire Direction Center took the observer's target and corrected it for everything that bends a shell in flight: the wind, the temperature of the powder, the wear inside each barrel, the curve of the earth itself. Then it handed each gun a direction and an elevation. The crews turned their hand wheels to the numbers. They did not look up at what they were about to hit because there was nothing in front of them to see. At its sharpest, the system could do something almost no other army could. Several batteries, miles apart, would each compute the flight time of their own shells and fire at staggered moments, timed so that every round in the air came down at the same instant. They called it time on target. For the men underneath it, there was no warning. No ranging round creeping closer, no second to get down. The first they knew of it was the whole sky arriving at once. That was the war the 561st was trained to fight. A war of mathematics and elevation tables waged on places the gunners would never see, against people who never saw it coming. It was brutal physical labor, this war of mathematics. Shell and powder loaded separately. The 95-pound projectile heaved up to the breech and rammed home. The charge set in behind it. The breech swung shut, the lanyard pulled, and then the whole sequence again. Around every 80 or 90 seconds when the calls kept coming, a crew moving tons of steel and powder across a day. And through all of it, the men at the gun saw nothing of the enemy. The only man who saw was the observer, and he paid for the privilege. The crews were the safe ones, miles back. The observer crawled forward with the infantry into the tree lines and the broken towns, close enough to see the target and therefore close enough to be killed for it. That was the bargain artillery struck. The watcher up front carried the risk so the guns behind could stay untouched. It held as long as there was a front and a rear and distance between them. Now reverse it. Take the distance away. Put the enemy in the next field. And the most powerful field gun in the army becomes the thing it was never meant to be. 15 tons in the open that cannot see well, cannot turn fast, and cannot run. 10 months earlier, and 1,000 miles south, the same gun had fought exactly the way its designers intended, and it had been magnificent. In January 1944, the Allies came ashore at Anzio on the Italian coast below Rome, and were promptly pinned into a shallow beachhead that the Germans ringed with guns. It turned into one of the great artillery battles of the war, and the Long Tom sat in the heart of it, doing precisely its job. The heavy battalions set up well behind the infantry line, in fields and orchards around Nettuno, dug in and draped with camouflage netting, each piece with room behind the trail for the barrel to slam back through its full recoil and be caught and returned, the way the engineers had drawn it. Signal Corps cameras filmed them there, tractors hauling the long barrels into position under the nets. A photograph from that February carries a caption that says all of it in 2 words. Long Tom speaks. Anzio was a strange place to be the safe end of anything, because nowhere on that beachhead truly was. The lodgement was small and flat, and the Germans held the heights around it, so their guns could rake the whole of it. The harbour and the supply dumps, and the gun lines along with everything else. The Long Toms fired from the rear, the way they were built to, but the rear at Anzio still sat inside the enemy's reach. The crews worked under camouflage and incoming fire at once and kept firing. That is the distinction that would matter so much 10 months later. At Anzio, they were shelled, but they were shelled at a distance, doing the job the gun was made for. They were not lowering their barrels at armour in the next field. They spoke a great deal. By the middle of February, the Allied guns at Anzio were firing 20,000 rounds a day, and when the Germans threw their great counterattack at the beachhead, it was the massed artillery, as much as anything, that broke it, tearing the assault columns apart before they could close. Across the battle, the Allied guns outshot the German by something close to 10-1. The Germans had monsters of their own. 2 Krupp railway guns the troops christened Anzio Annie and the Anzio Express, lobbing quarter-ton shells into the beachhead from concealed positions behind the front. The heavy battalions hunted them, firing counter-battery, straining to locate and silence them. And the honest record matters here, because the popular story says an American gun knocked out Anzio Annie, and it did not. The railway guns were never pinned down until late May, and in the end they got away by rail, one of them taken by the Americans only at the war's close. The duel was real. The clean kill is something people wished into the story afterward. But the larger point holds. At Anzio, the Long Tom was a king of the field, used exactly as designed, behind the line, unseen, and as designed, it was among the most effective weapons in the theatre. That is the gun that would end up on a hill east of St. Vith 10 months later, firing over open sights at an enemy it could finally see. The Ardennes in December 1944 was supposed to be the quiet place. It was where the American army sent tired divisions to rest and green ones to learn. A thin screen along a wooded front that no one expected to be tested. On the 15th of December, the daily situation report for 8th Corps summed up the entire sector in 4 words. There is nothing to report. At 5:30 the next morning, some 1,600 German guns opened fire along an 80-mile front. Behind one stretch of that front, doing the deep firework it was built for, sat the 561st, backing up the 106th Infantry Division. The 106th was new, untried, and stretched too thin across too much ground, and it was holding the exact spot the Germans had chosen to break through. That is not hindsight. By the battalion's own account, that is precisely where the 561st was, backing the 106th at the place the blow landed hardest. When the line in front came apart, nothing stood between the gun positions and the German spearheads but distance, and the distance was vanishing by the hour. Hours before, these had been guns doing the patient, deep work of a quiet sector, ranging on crossroads and assembly areas miles off. Now those map coordinates were driving toward them on tracks. There is a particular vertigo in that. The safe distance that had defined everything was gone in a single morning, and the targets they used to plot at 14 miles were close enough to hear through the trees. This is the thing a long-range gun fears most, and the thing its whole way of fighting exists to prevent. A Long Tom battalion can barely defend itself up close. No armor, little infantry of its own, a gun that takes minutes, not seconds, to move. Doctrine answered with depth. Keep the heavy guns far enough back that the front can never reach them, and pull them rearward in stages if it tries, one battery covering another. But depth only works if the front holds long enough to use it, and this front did not. Within a day, German armor was loose among positions that had been planned as safe rear areas. St. Vith itself, the road and rail hub the whole defense turned on, became a front-line town almost overnight, held by the 7th Armored Division and a patchwork of units shoved together to save it. They held it brilliantly from the 17th to the 23rd, and in holding it they jammed and slowed the entire German timetable. But the heavy guns behind them could not stand and wait to be overrun. They had to keep firing, and then they had to get out. For the 561st, getting out meant going through the mud. Back on that hill above the valley. Charlie Battery had dug in on high ground, and when the German tanks pushed up the valley below, the crews did the thing their whole profession is built to avoid. They depressed the long barrels until they were nearly level and fired on the tanks directly over open sights, at a range where they could watch their own round strike. It was not a stunt, and it was not a last stand stage for anyone. It was a battery buying time with the only currency it had, its own presence on that hill, while the rest of the battalion fought to hook its guns to tractors and crawl them out onto the roads. Charlie Battery covered the withdrawal for everyone else, and it stayed too long, on purpose, because that was the job. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Robert C. White, gave his battery commanders an order folded in two. Save everything that could be saved, the guns, the vehicles, the men, and destroy everything that could not be pulled back in time. The second half is the one that costs a man something. To a gun crew, the piece is not equipment. It is the center of the whole craft, the thing they have hauled and cleaned and trusted across a continent. White was telling them to be ready to wreck their own. But that was still ahead of them. First, the collapse had to finish closing in. It was already swallowing the men who never expected to fight at all. Service battery, the cooks and drivers and supply handlers who in any normal week were the safest soldiers in the outfit, had no distance left to hide behind. A private named Henry Krause from Trenton, New Jersey, died of wounds on the 16th, in the snarl of roads near Schönberg, where the German spearheads and the retreating Americans collided in the dark. How he was hit, the record does not say, and it would be a lie to invent it. Private Leonard Maitland was taken prisoner. Private William Cole and Staff Sergeant Eldon Hill were wounded and got out only because tankers of the 7th Armoured found them and carried them to the rear. These were the Rear-Echelon Men of a long-range battalion, overrun because the distance their guns existed to hold had collapsed to nothing. And the battalion was already running. What was happening east of St. Vith had stopped being a battle and become an escape, begun even as Charlie Battery still fired. The route west reads like a map of the Ardennes coming apart. St. Vith, then Krombach, then the villages beyond. For long stretches, by the battalion's own account, no more than half a mile separated it from the enemy. Half a mile for a weapon built to do its work from 14. Everything that had ever made the Long Toms safe, the distance, the depth, the unseen calm of the rear, was gone. And these men were living inside the precise, close-range fear their guns existed to keep them out of. A German ambush caught a ration truck and the battalion was left, by its own count, with a single meal in hand. Cold, hunted, dragging what guns they could through mud and fog with the enemy a field away, they kept the column crawling west. But some of the guns would not move at all. Charlie Battery, still on its hill, still firing, was stuck fast. The thaw and the shell fire had turned the ground to a soup that swallowed the wheels, and a Long Tom on the move weighed some 15 tons. The battalion's own history puts it without a shred of drama, which is exactly why it lands. Not only did the battery keep the 155s blazing until the last possible moment, it reads, but it was hopeless to move the guns in the mud. Set those two halves together and the ending is already written. If you fire until the last possible moment, and the guns will not move, then when the last moment comes, the guns are still there, and so is the enemy, and you cannot take them with you. The last moment came. So the men of Charlie Battery destroyed 3 of their own Long Toms. They did it the way only gunners would think to. One gun they killed with an incendiary grenade, letting the burning charge ruin the works. The others they turned against themselves. Recall the recoil, the heart of the weapon. A Long Tom is built so that when it fires, the barrel slides back along its cradle and is caught and returned smoothly, ready for the next round. At Anzio, they had given the guns room behind the trail for exactly that, the full clean stroke, the mark of a weapon used right. Here in the mud, the crews pulled the recoil nut from a gun, loaded, stood clear and fired. Firing it that way threw the tube off its slide and ruined the recoil mechanism. They used the gun's own enormous power, the 14-mile punch that was its entire reason for being, to break it where it stood. Think about what that asks of a man. He has spent the war serving this gun, trusting it, the most powerful thing in his world. And now, with the enemy in earshot and the mud holding the wheels fast, he loads it one last time, knowing the round will never reach a target. It will stay inside the gun and break it. He pulls the lanyard on his own weapon and walks away from the wreck on foot. No name comes down to us for the man who pulled that lanyard. The battalion history does not record which crew destroyed which gun, and the rosters that might have told us did not survive anywhere we could find. So we will not invent him. We know only what was done and what it must have asked of the men who did it. To turn your own gun into a bomb and fire it deliberately, because the one thing worse than losing it was leaving it whole for the enemy to swing around. The battalion got out, barely. By midday on the 17th, what was left of the 561st had pulled back through St. Vith, and it was not the only gun battalion living that nightmare. All across the Ardennes, heavy and medium artillery were being dragged into close fights they were never built for. On the 21st of December, the 561st passed to Patton's Third Army, swinging up from the south, and the worst was behind it. As the Bulge was pressed back and erased, the battalion returned to the work it knew, the far-off mathematical work, hitting targets it could not see, part of the massed American artillery that now took the offensive apart from a distance. On the 4th of February 1945, it came back to the very positions it had left. The same ground, not the same battalion. Set the 2 days side by side. At Anzio, given the distance it was born for and the room behind the trail for its full recoil, the long tom was among the most effective weapons on Earth. East of St. Vith, 10 months later, the same gun was 15 tons of liability sinking in the mud, killed by its own crew with that same recoil turned against it. Same gun, same recoil. One day the clean stroke was the sign of a weapon used right. The next, defeating it was how the weapon died. That is not a flaw in the long tom. It is the truth about every specialized thing, written in steel and recoil oil. A tool that is supreme at one task, used exactly as meant, can be helpless the instant it is forced to be something else. The gun chose neither day. Men chose. A forward observer in a tree chose the target the crews could not see. Charlie Battery chose to hold that hill and fire over open sights. Lieutenant Colonel White chose the order. And a gunner whose name did not survive chose to fire his own gun to death rather than give it up whole. Go back one last time to that note falling out of the sky. German tanks are in Setz, heading our way. It was a warning to a battalion of guns that could strike a target 14 miles away and could not save themselves from one in the next valley. Everything that followed, the open sights, the order, the burning gun, the gun fired to death, the half-mile retreat, was the 561st answering that note the only way left to them. Not with distance, which was gone, with the men. We did not take this story from a documentary or an encyclopedia. We took it from the battalion's own combat history, a thin pamphlet the men of the 561st printed in 1945 in their own plain words, and we read it page by page. Near the back is a roll of the dead, under 2 words, lest we forget. Henry Krause is on it. So are men this video never named, because the record was thin, because the cooks and clerks and gun chiefs of a corps artillery battalion were not the sort of soldiers anyone wrote books about. If your father, your grandfather, or your uncle served in the Field Artillery in the Ardennes, in the 561st, or in any of the corps battalions that held that line and dragged their heavy guns back out of the trap, leave his name and his unit in the comments. Tell us what he told you. That is how a battalion like this stays remembered, one name at a time, carried by the people who came after. They held the wrong gun for the fight, in the wrong place, in the worst week of the war in the West, and they did not let go of it until they had fired the last shell out of it and made certain the enemy would never fire it back. Built to reach 14 miles, killed at point-blank range, in the mud, by the men who knew it best,